In the late 2nd century, the concept of the Logos became the first truly integrative, systematizing principle in early Christian literature. Irenaeus's Against Heresies, written between 182 and 188, describes and critiques Gnostic frameworks and beliefs and draws upon an emergent framework, emergent, not fully fleshed out, an emergent framework known as the history of salvation or salvation history, and scripture, traditions, and apostolic succession as guarantors of the authenticity of the Christian message. Origen's On First Principles, written between 212 and 215, is a work of systematic reflection that is ultimately censured. He was excommunicated posthumously for his assertion that all of creation, including the devil, is ultimately redeemed. But that work on first principles also lays the groundwork for discerning what is to become standardized as orthodoxy in the Nicene and Chalcedonian councils of the later 4th and 5th centuries. It fell to Augustine in the 5th century to develop a comprehensive and unified synthesis that serves as the basis of Protestant as well as Catholic orthodoxy by solidifying the role of salvation history as the framework on which to hang theological reflection. Why is salvation history still one of the most important theological traditions that informs many Christians in postmodernity? I think that the story of one who suffers innocently, who becomes the Redeemer, and who is himself redeemed, is a story that has affinity with the stories of all the suffering. It is a story of vindication and ultimate victory over every evil that humans encounter, including the last evil, death. By illuminating for us the relationship between the story and his story, the premier spiritual autobiographer Augustine did not coin the phrase, but illuminated the mind, heart, and soul of the school of thought known as fides quaerens intellectum, or faith in search of understanding. From the 4th century through the 12th centuries, the church shifted its self-understanding to reflect the changing political and cultural realities it faced. From the time of the ascension of Constantine in 306 and his imperial patronage of the church amassed social and political power and economic power, and the power to redefine the Roman pagan culture that it would eventually come to supplant. Increasingly vested in that power, the institutionalizing church came to generate doctrines that both shielded it from critique and allowed it to be the final earthly adjudicator of the appropriateness or inappropriateness of private human experience based on its assessment of what was orthodox or unorthodox. Although the era of the scholastics between 1100 and 1500 was marked with rigorous inquiry, theologians of that era, including Anselm of Bec and Canterbury, whose years are from 1033 to 1109, Peter Abelard, whose years are from 1079 to 1142, Duns Scotus, whose years are from 1265 to 1308, and Thomas Aquinas, whose years are from 1225 to 1274. These all partially conceived their tasks as that of establishing orthodoxy, that referred to the by then fully established framework of salvation history as one of the central markers of orthodox faith. And remember, when we talk about orthodoxy, we're not simply talking about what we in postmodernity refer to as standardized thinking. We're referring to a specific period in the history of the church when it was trying to determine what was correct doctrine that glorified God, correct teaching that enlightened the being of God. So now I want to share with you some notes on reason as part of a continuation of the methodological portion of our work that we will be doing. The underlying question of the scholastics was, what is the relationship of reason to faith? Several centuries before, Tertullian had posed nearly the same question in this way: what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? The Greco-Roman North African philosophical, religious, cultural, and social context, rife with intellectual questions about the nature of good and evil, contrasted with the practical question about the nature and ends of life, and the role of religion therein in the Jewish-Palestinian context out of which Christianity emerged. Although Augustine in the 4th century and 5th century gave the parameters what would become a unique school of thought, Anselm in the 12th century articulated the orthodox formula for establishing the relationship between reason and faith, intellect and practical considerations as a quest for intellectual clarity and comprehensibility, citing Fides Carens Intellectum, faith in search of understanding. The sources of theology, scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, are common tools that theistic Abrahamic traditions use to speak intelligibly about the divine, who is also affirmed as ineluctable, ineffable, and inexhaustible mystery. The ways in which we utilize these mighty resources, vested with the power of communities from the ancient past until the present day, to influence, if not define, the very course of individuals, societies, civilizations even, reflect the norms or principles, formal and informal, by which we govern our lives as moral beings and as moral collectives, as acting or acting upon subjects. For example, what devolves to the church in postmodernity as Christian orthodoxy was an attempt by the early church to establish appropriate and inappropriate ways of interpreting and reinterpreting and representing the faith. Norms often reflect the limits of the scientific knowledge of the day. They can also reflect the social, political, and economic privilege or lack thereof of particular groups. Norms can be explicit or they may remain hidden, subject to be revealed at a later time. In the history of Christian thought, differing norms from within have led to schism, repression, and reform, and have resulted in a plethora of denominations that interpret the faith and perform the rites of the church idiosyncratically, according to the very norms the different factions have set for themselves regarding the way to manage the sources of theological reflection. As a systematic theologian, it is vitally important to establish what are your grounding principles, what are your grounding norms, by examining both the antecedents of our confessions and what we are really confessing about God.